Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session. Thank you so much for joining. Today we are having the book launch of Disability Interactions. This is a fantastic opportunity to hear from the authors and just find out a little bit more about the publication and I guess what's inside. So just a little bit on accessibility for today's session. Closed captioning is available, so you'll be seeing that on your screen. If you haven't currently got access, you should be able to push the closed caption button which normally located at the bottom of your screen. We do really welcome any questions you've got throughout the session. So if there's anything particular you want to ask the authors or find out a little bit more about, please do put that into the Q&A box. The chat function will be available if you want to communicate directly to any of the panelists, but we do ask for the questions to come through the Q&A box. So we limit the chat via the chat box just to make sure that the screen readers aren't interrupting anything on the session today. Questions, as I said, through the Q&A box, and this session will also be recorded and shared afterwards, so you'll be able to follow up or join or catch up at another point should you be joining from another country. So coming up today, we're going to be hearing from the authors of the session and finding out a little bit more about why the book was put together and what is the framework around disability interactions, and also how this book and this approach can be really useful for you and the work that you might be doing, and also a little bit more information about how you can find out more, and then we'll finish up with those Q&A sessions, Q&As as well, that might be coming on from you as we go through the session. So we were going to begin with hearing from Yvonne, who I think is on the line now. Hi, Yvonne. So I'll hand across to you to introduce yourself and maybe just give a little bit of an introduction into some of this work.
Hi there. Yeah, sorry, there's a trouble with Zoom and calendars. I clicked on the link in the calendar and it took me where there was no one there. And then Louise kindly sent me an email to say you're in the wrong room. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to do these kinds of book launches in person again. I just want to say I think it's fantastic that Kathy and Julia have managed to write this during lockdown. Most of us were just simply exhausted. The idea of writing a book was far too much. And it's a joy to have seen this work develop from early ideas. Particularly a few years ago, I had many conversations with Kathy about her wanting to write a manifesto. So a draft went back and forth between us it got to a point where I said, I think it's ready now. So it was sent to the ACM Interactions magazine, which was accepted. And I think that was one of the seeds for this book. And this idea of disability interactions, or DICS for short, it's a really great manifesto and way of capturing what it is that makes them stand apart from all the many other approaches which have been, thinking about how you design assistive technology for disabled people. And I think this is a real shift in how you think about disability and also technology, and also thinking about how you engage with people with various kinds of disabilities so that they can become co-designers, co-creators. And so I think what they've done in this book is take that manifesto and really grow it and illustrate it with lots of really good case studies of how you can do this type of design and approach. And I was flicking through it this morning, and I really like the way in which you've included a number of case studies from people working in this area at the leading edge, and getting them to write it. So you hear their voices as well as all of the stuff that you've been writing as well. So that's really nice. And I love the illustrations. When I wrote a book for this particular publisher, we weren't allowed to have colourful illustrations, let alone a colour cover. So that's only in the last few years, and that brings me on to think about the cover, which is absolutely fantastic. And I think it was one of your participants who came up with that, with 5 wheels at the front of the wheelchair, and so colourful to think about all of the things that are possible and imaginable. So I think that's a real eye catcher. So that you must be congratulated on that wonderful cover and that choice of it. So just a bit more about my involvement in this book was I was given a chapter 2 or 3 to read when it was bubbling up and being formed. And I had a big discussion about whether or not this type of work should be framed in a bigger context of not just designing technology, but to think about the grand challenges, if you like. And Kathy was very adamant that she should put this into the context of wicked problems. And we went back and forth. And I said, I don't know whether you should be doing this, because wicked problems is something about big software systems. But I noticed it's still in there and it has its place. But also that to think about DICS in relation to HCI and what the relationship is between those. And it may be that one day it takes over the whole of HCI, but who knows? But I think at the end, it's a very nice way of moving the field forwards. It's very sensitive to people's needs and also their involvement, and also to be thinking about designing for accessibility. And at the end, I was surprised it says, let's look ahead for the next 60 years. So I'm going to finish on that point and say, why just 60 years? What happens in 60 years? That will be 2082. So I shall stop there and say, well done, congratulations, and everyone should have a copy of this.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. A fantastic question there, just to finish up. So that was brilliant, and I will most definitely not be answering that question myself, but in fact I will hand across to Kathy first of all, just to introduce herself, and then we'll have a quick introduction from Julia, and then maybe we can come back to that question a little bit later on as well, unless there's a quick answer, Kathy, but I think that might be somewhat challenging, but I shall hand across to you.
I know I do love Yvonne's easy questions, but no, there's a bit of a longer answer to that. So I'm Kathy Holloway. I'm a co-founder and the academic director of the Global Disability Innovation Hub, and a professor at UCL's Interaction Centre for Interaction Design and Innovation, where I have great fun talking to Yvonne and other colleagues about how we advance the sector of design and technology. And at GDI Hub, I have great adventures in the world of global assistive technology provision and disability theory and development theory. So these hopefully have come together a little bit in this book. And I'll hand over to Julia to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your introduction, Yvonne. It's one of the most humbling thing I've heard in quite a while. I'll give you a quick and cheeky answer to your question about why 60 year. We picked that date because it was going to be Kathy's 100th birthday. So that seemed like a fitting deadline for.
I couldn't remember what exactly it was. I knew it was something like that, but I couldn't remember exactly what.
First look into the future. My name is Julia Barbareschi. I'm a JSPS research fellow at the Keio Graduate School of Media Design in Yokohama in Japan. But I'm also an honorary lecturer in disability innovation at GDI Hub and UCLIC, and that's actually where sort of most of the writing for this book was done. And so one of the things I have the privilege to start is to tell you a little bit about why we wrote this book in the first place. And Yvonne, it's right. The book was published a few weeks ago, but it was written throughout 2021. And I can assure you that in the evenings and weekend that Kathy and I spent sort of discussing chapters and trying to write sections of the book, we did ask ourselves many times while we were doing this. The reality is that this has probably been in the making since we started working together in, I believe, was 2014, but possibly even before that. Kathy and I come from two very different fields. I have a medical background, she has an engineering one. And we've both worked across so many different fields and disciplines between HCI, assistive technologies, rehabilitation, disability, transport. And one of the things that happens when you do this type of work across so many different fields, it's that you spend a preposterous amount of time discussing and explaining the importance of other disciplines.
Academic pursuit.
And
keep going, Julia.
And the reality is that sometimes it seems like we're speaking different languages, but the goals we have are very much the same. And in a very different way, it's an incredibly enriching experience. And we really wanted to emphasize what we can learn from each other when coming and integrating different disciplines, and trying to move from the focus on the interactions between an individual and the technologies and other individuals around it, but also bring in this broader systems, this wicked problems that were mentioned earlier, in which these technologies are deployed. And that's what we tried to do when writing the DICS framework that Kathy is going to tell you a bit more about.
Thanks, Julia. And you'll see that wicked problems are there, Yvonne, right at the bottom in the center. And I'm going to start with this idea of wicked problems, because there was a big discussion between Yvonne and I, and Yvonne was saying things like, well, if you're talking about poverty, then how is technology meant to solve poverty? And I was saying things like, well, if we're going to mediate so much of life through technology, then it has to tackle these big problems of sustainability, poverty, inequality. Otherwise, inherent in our design, we amplify those biases and those inequalities. So but I take Yvonne's point that it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And so we didn't want to overwhelm people, think, well, actually, it's just such a big problem. It's got nothing to do with us. I'll go back to my old way of working. So we sort of frame everything around the idea that there is this wicked problem. There are loads of wicked problems. There's lots of very difficult challenges facing society at the moment. But if we understand that, and in particular the one with poverty, so if you're a disabled person or a person with a disability, you are more likely to be poor. And if you're poor, you're more likely to have a disability. And that's quite a shocking statistic, because it happens everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're in London or Kibera in Kenya, it's the same. And so we need to know that when we're designing technologies, because it can influence how they are able to scale and how we're able to get them to people. And so that leads me, if we go around the circle, to look at value and usefulness. So oftentimes within healthcare systems or within education systems, where a lot of assistive products or technologies that aid people with disabilities to interact with their daily lives, they're actually purchased not by individuals, they're purchased by big systems. They're purchased sometimes by UN organizations, sometimes by national government, sometimes by the National Health Service. And if you don't understand those systems, then you might have a brilliant bit of kit, but it never goes anywhere, or you manage to get a startup for a couple of years, but then it folds. And all of our research, Julia and I, and some of the others people have joined the call, so thank you for joining. But we've been working in the space for a number of years now, and it's categorical proof everywhere you go that if you're trying to scale an assistive technology or an accessible solution, it is harder than say a standard healthcare technology. And there's lots of reasons for that, and a lot of it in the book. So we want to begin to think about this open and scalable idea. How do we bed that in from the start? And we think that building on Schneiderman's work of applied and basic research, that's a fundamental part. So if you're out doing research in the wild, as one of Yvonne's books was about, and you're out in the field, so for those of you who are not computer scientists, in the wild just means leaving the lab, speaking to the outside world. If people who are not computer scientists, and you engage in communities and you run research where technology is being used, you run the research, then fundamentally, as you're doing that, you will find new applied problems. And we found that as an example, one of my PhD students, Tigmanshu's work on his new product, Tessilia, going out to schools in India, understanding the challenges of blind and partially sighted children trying to learn to read, made us look fundamentally at material science problem. How do we then use this new material science, which is a basic piece of research, to then deliver a new applied solution? And you go around that loop. And as Yvonne has mentioned, we care about co-creation, and co-creation, I always say, comes at lots of levels. Before we came along and we wrote this book, there's loads of people who've done stuff on participatory design and co-design. It doesn't matter if you're in the medical field or if you're in the HCI field, you've got ability-based design. We've got great frameworks. When we say co-created, we don't just mean with people with disabilities, we mean a level above that. We mean all the systems people as well, so that everybody's in there together. So you're working with the manufacturer of advice whilst you're developing it, so you know you're going to be able to scale it, for example, or you're working with the education industry so that you can scale it. And so that also brings in some of the development work that's been happening in HCI. So really in the stuff that we've written about in co-created solutions, it's not so much, I think, new. It's more bringing in 2 or 3 different fields and just presenting them together, possibly for the first time. And so we hope that all of that will lead to some radically different interactions. Julia, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but just before I came on the call, was talking about holograms on wheelchairs. Like, would we like to have those things? So beginning to really think about artistic representations of things and how we move forward. And then this inner circle, this inner circle becomes the sort of dimensions that we begin to measure things by. So Louise, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. We put 2 of them together, power and participation. But when we had the framework initially in one draft of the book, we began to realize that's fine, but how the hell would you know if you've actually made any progress, right? Especially against a wicked problem or open and scalable, or even the ABC, the applied and basic science, agenda, research agenda. So then we started thinking about what are these sort of dimensions that we can pull out of each project that we've seen already emerging in HCI across different areas, that we could maybe bring together. And so one of them was around, we call it overly simple problems and then impactful problems. But basically, I don't think anybody's really tackling overly simple problems anymore, but we're still not tackling hugely impactful problems. So how do we begin to shift the needle along that? And again, on well-being, moving from deficit-based design, where we look at people's things that they can't do, rather than looking at where we currently sit with HCI research, which is Warburg's ability-based design, building on that to also maybe work with, say, Calvo's positive computing bit to bring in the mental health side and begin to look at an overarching look at wellness and how we strengthen our wellness. And power and participation looks at 2 dimensions, really. One is of a disabled person themselves, making sure that that person or group of people are fully included in how we design studies, implement studies, are part of the analysis process, have power in that analysis and in the messaging that comes out of a project, but also that if we go back to that initial link between poverty and power and disability, that we begin to shift the power to the global south, that we begin to look at how we begin to develop products and solutions that are there. And then finally, we have this innovation dimension where closed innovation and open innovation. Open innovation doesn't mean open source innovation. It doesn't mean give things away for free. It means how do you collaborate more easily? Not, for example, I used to work in a big med tech company, and I remember a product of mine that I helped design with lots of other people didn't go to market because a competitor didn't put something out. But we didn't file patents, we didn't do anything, we just hid the IP. We just hid it internally. Like nobody will ever know that exists because they just didn't want it out there. And for the disability space, we don't want that. We want, if you can't commercialize something, that's okay, but let's see, somebody else might be able to. So we're beginning to build that dimension. And I would argue that final dimension is probably maybe the newest one into this space within HCI, at least. Me.
So yeah, finally, like the $1 million question, like why would this book be of any use to you? Well, one of the things, as Kathy was touching upon, if you're interested in learning more about disability inclusive HCI research, we do touch throughout the book at some of the latest and earliest more impactful development in the field. If you're coming more from a tech or an HCI space and what you're trying to do is understand the complexity of the AT system in which assistive technologies, but also mainstream accessible technologies are deployed and operate, We try to do that, and we explore this concept of disability interactions, both at a personal and broader level across different domains. We look at education, from how an individual student learn to how sort of curriculums are designed and how things might or might not be adopted within sort of schools or national education systems. We do similar things in health and look at the broader system of employment. And we also look at different geographies of how these systems take completely different shapes depending on their cultural, economic, and geographical context. And finally, yeah, we've been incredibly lucky to have so many different contributors, from academia to industry to practitioners, that work in different areas of the world, across different domains that are of interest to disability, tech, and inclusions. And they bring their examples, and you can hear their voice and see what the most impactful disability interactions around at the moment are, and why they're successful. Finally, like, we were so lucky to have our very good friend and amazing artist, Jason Wilshire Mill, doing the cover of the illustration of the cover of our book. So it actually, you know, looks pretty impressive on any bookcase, which is definitely like an added value. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, I would say you can.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Julia and Kathy. Really interesting just to hear a little bit more in depth around, I guess, the approach, disability interactions approach, and why it's so nuanced. And I guess how it's bringing together lots of different thinking across many different kind of sectors, and a multidisciplinary approach to this space. I think it's really particularly interesting hearing a little bit around that kind of, I guess maybe the magic in the middle, and that's really core to, I think, what the GDI Hub, working alongside UCL and UCLIC, are really looking to deliver is that where we can push things in new directions, and really kind of delve in a bit more deeply into these quite complex areas that we've outlined. So that brings us quite nicely onto the dissemination of this publication. So obviously the book is available, and it's available to view and look for all those kind of joining, and that's there's a link available that you can purchase the book. But what we're also going to do is do a series of interviews. As Julia picked up on, there was a lot of different contributors to this book, and it also covers a really vast array of different topics and subjects. So it gives us the opportunity to look in a little bit more detail around some of those elements that are discussed throughout the book. And those will be coming out in the kind of coming months. So we'll keep everybody updated on those for how you can join. So there'll be a set of kind of interviews that will be able to be viewed digitally or as a podcast. And they will just give you that little bit more of an oversight of some of the case studies and the specific themes that are running through the book as well. So we're about coming towards the end of our session, but what we wanted to do is just give it a bit of an opportunity for a couple of Q&As. So if you're joining today and you've got any particular questions, potentially around how disability interactions might sit within your area of work or your area of study, please do pop them in the Q&A box. But just to start us off, I think it's been really interesting just to hear about how this approach came about, where it, I guess, kind of came from, and how the thinking has evolved, and sounds like it will also continue to evolve in this space. So I guess my question, and I think I'll come to Kathy on this one, is why has this not been done before, and where do you see this kind of progressing from this point here?
I think it's a certain point in time. I think if you go back to the first Global Disability Summit, for example, in 2018, there was a sort of a global sort of flag in the ground, if you like, that we're going to now focus really on helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals around disability. And I think before that, efforts had been quite fragmented. So on the one hand, the global disability space has moved, and people are beginning to focus more on this area. Secondly, I think there's been, we're getting older, people are living longer. And then thirdly, we've got the unique opportunity of COVID. So there's been a couple of great papers. Emma, I think, is a participant recently, and people wrote a paper about AT and COVID, for example, and use. And then at May Youth, Kenna wrote another paper about the social impact of COVID on assistive technology users. And really looking at that idea that we've had an insight, every single person on the planet has an insight into the challenges and inconveniences and difficulties when systems don't work, and when you're impeded by an inaccessible environment. In this case, the inaccessible environment happened to be a virus, which then ended up meaning like lots of lockdown problems and other issues. But it's also an opportunity there. I also think HCI has emerged and matured to a great extent. I think the user-based studies in human-computer interaction around disability are very mature now. How to do co-design is very mature at a relatively small level, at an individual level where we're developing technologies for a group of people, a small group. I think we're very mature. And so I think things have just come together at a nice time for this. And I think maybe just personally, it was also a good moment with Julia and I had sort of done quite a lot of work together and felt like there was enough there that there was something, we weren't quite sure what it was, but there was something that maybe could contribute to moving the argument forward. And hopefully we've managed to do that a little bit, but I suspect it's just the start, as all these things are. I hope that answers your question.
I really think so.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kathy. And we've just had a question come in on the Q&A box, and it's asking around how the approach places itself in relation to universal design approach. So that's the idea that the design should be designed in a way that both people with disabilities and people doesn't have specific disabilities can use in the same way. So Julia, we'll maybe come to you on that. It'd be really interesting just to hear through that context and how that.
Yeah, like I actually love that question because we do, it's interesting. We do touch upon that in one of the chapters of the book very specifically. Because universal design, inclusive design, sort of the embedding of accessibility into mainstream products have placed a huge shift into what sort of like design around disability and assistive technologies is. And the reality is that the disability interactions coexist with all these approaches and try to bring them together, because inclusive design, universal design have revolutionized the space, but they will always coexist with assistive technology as well. There will always be the need for some form of dedicated technologies. You also have newer frameworks like the ability-based design that talks about sort of flexible interfaces that change depending on what the person can do and adapt sort of to their needs. And those also come in, and what they do, it's a lot of these systems focus on the personal interaction with the technologies, but at the same time, they also change the system level of how things are delivered and work. Because if we think about traditional, pass me the term, assistive technologies like wheelchair versus more inclusive technology like mobile phones, they work on two different types of larger sort of technology systems that sort of coexist and have to live together. And that's how sort of we try to merge them and find ways in which things can slot together a little bit more easily.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julia. It's really interesting just to hear that kind of context of how it relates to those different spaces as well. So we're coming towards the end of the session now, and I can see we've had a couple more questions come in, run specifically around interest from policymakers in disability interactions, and one around looking at how it might apply to disability recreational sports participation. So it'll be really interesting just to touch on some of those things as we kind of move forward in kind of sharing a little little bit more information about this topic. There's a quite big weighty questions that I'm not sure we're going to have quite the space to come to right now. But please do pop anything in the question and answer box or come to us directly following this session. If there's anything particularly you think would be really interesting that we can touch on as we start to do the kind of recorded interviews and podcasts that we make available after the session and in the coming kind of months ahead as well. So those are all more things that we can touch on in a little bit more detail as we go into a little bit more depth around this area. So just to finish up, really, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Kathy and Julia, and congratulations on the publication. And a huge thank you to Yvonne for joining us, and also Morgan and Claypool, the publishers. We'll just come to you, Kathy, really just for any final words before we wrap up. But I also just noticed there's someone asking a bit of a question around kind of MSc research, and it might be a good point just to mention, if you're just joining or just starting out in this field or interested in finding out a little bit more, the Global Disability Innovation Hub run an MSc program on disability design and innovation. That's run from UCL, but is also collaboratively alongside the Loughborough University London and the London College of Fashion. So it's a really fascinating multidisciplinary course that touches on a huge amount of what's been mentioned today, and those different elements that fit into disability interactions. So that might also be one to consider if you're a student joining today who's looking at how you might further your expertise or studies within this field as well. So Kathy, I'll just hand across to you for any final words before we wrap up. And we'll be following up with you all joining us today about a little bit more information on this in the future.
So I would just say thank you to everybody. We couldn't have written it without Yvonne and everyone in GDI Hub with some support there, and also the case studies. The people who've written the case studies, they really helped evolve our thinking with each chapter as well. It wasn't just the case study, it really did help. There were also 2 reviewers of the book that gave some really insightful comments and feedback, and definitely improved a couple of sections in particular that I think are now much stronger. I read some literature I genuinely didn't know about when one of them pointed some out, and so we keep learning. So I just like to say thank you. I really do hope it's the start of a conversation, and we can see how we can begin to do what some of the questions have said, is an influence policymakers into the technology design, but also make sure that disabled people are leading this. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Yvonne, for taking the time to come and say a few words today. And Julia, it's good to see you.
Everyone, that's it for today, and we'll hopefully hear from you all soon. Take care. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jason, for the artwork. Bye. Thank you.